In the spring of 1872, a New Mexican trader named Eduardo Ortiz was taken by federal troops somewhere along the edge of the Texas Panhandle, and what he told his captors changed the shape of a war that had already lasted 2 centuries. Ortiz was a Comanchero, one of hundreds of Hispano traders who had spent generations moving between the New Mexican settlements and the camps of the Comanche and Kiowa on the southern plains. He knew the country the way a river pilot knows a channel, not from maps, because there were no reliable maps of that country, but from having crossed it on cart trails his own family had likely helped cut. Under questioning, Ortiz told the army where the main body of the Comanche nation was wintering. He said they were camped along the Red River, out on the flat, waterless tableland the Spanish had named the Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains. He said the army could move troops through that country if it moved them correctly. For a military that had spent years failing to find the Comanche in their own territory, this was not a minor detail. It was the first real crack in a wall that had held for 150 years. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Sherman himself had nearly become a casualty of that same unmapped country the year before. In May of 1871, he rode along a stretch of road near Fort Richardson, Texas, only hours ahead of a Kiowa raiding party that struck a wagon train at Salt Creek, killed 7 teamsters, and left the wreckage for the general to find on his return journey. The attack, carried out by warriors under the leadership of Satanta, Satank, and Big Tree, convinced Sherman that the reservation system meant to contain the Southern Plains tribes was failing in practice, and it hardened federal policy toward the kind of aggressive campaigning that would define the following 3 years. Satanta and Big Tree were arrested and tried in a Texas civilian court, an unusual step at the time, while Satank was shot attempting to escape his army escort. None of it slowed the raids coming out of the Llano Estacado. If anything, it convinced Sherman and his officers that the problem could not be solved through arrests or treaties. It could only be solved by learning to move through the plain itself, and in 1871, the army still could not do that reliably. To understand why one captured trader's testimony mattered so much, you have to understand what the Comanche had built on that plain, and what it had cost every power that tried to take it from them. The Comanche were not the plains' original people. Linguistically and culturally they were Shoshone, and as late as the early 1600s, they were a small hunting people in the Great Basin, far to the northwest, without horses and without the reach that would later define them. Everything changed after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, when Spanish colonists were driven out of New Mexico and left behind herds of horses that spread north through indigenous trade networks faster than any Spanish document could track them. The Comanche took to the horse with a completeness that startled every group around them. Within a few generations, they had migrated south onto the southern plains, displaced the Apache who had held that ground before them, and built something that historians now describe, without much exaggeration, as an empire. Its capital, if it had one, was not a city, it was a territory, roughly the size of a small European nation, that the Spanish, and later the Mexicans, and later still the Texans and the Americans, all came to call Comancheria. Comancheria stretched across what is now the Texas Panhandle, eastern New Mexico, western Oklahoma, and parts of Kansas and Colorado, and at its center sat the Llano Estacado, a tableland so flat and so featureless that early Spanish travelers claimed they had to drive stakes into the ground to find their way back out of it. The Comanche did not merely survive on this plain. They mastered it in a way outsiders rarely could, moving with the buffalo herds that gave them food, shelter, tools, and trade goods, and moving their horse herds, which by the mid-19th century may have numbered in the tens of thousands, across grasslands that looked, to an American soldier, like nothing at all. The Comanche economy was not a subsistence economy hiding at the edge of American commerce. It was itself a hub of continental trade. Goods moved through Comanche hands from St. Louis, from Santa Fe, from Chihuahua, from the Wichita villages and from trading posts on the Arkansas and the Canadian rivers, and the Comanche controlled much of that flow, taxing it, directing it, and profiting from it, the way any power controlling a strategic crossroads profits from the traffic that has no choice but to pass through. Comanche society organized itself around bands rather than a single central authority. Groups such as the Penatica in the south, the Yamparica and Cotzateca farther north, and the Quijada, who held the heart of the Llano Estacado itself, and were among the last to accept reservation life. Each band followed its own leadership and its own seasonal calendar, converging periodically for large communal buffalo hunts and for trade, but rarely acting as a single unified nation, the way European observers expected a people that powerful to organize. This structure confused and frustrated American negotiators for decades, since a treaty signed with leaders of one band carried no binding weight over another, and it meant that even after large portions of the Comanche population accepted reservation terms at Fort Sill, other bands, particularly the Quijada under leaders like Quanah Parker, considered themselves under no such obligation and continued living on the plain exactly as their families always had. Women managed much of the buffalo economy that sustained this way of life, processing hides into robes and lodge coverings, drying and preserving meat for winter, and producing the tools and clothing that made a mobile society possible, work that consumed more labor hours across a Comanche band than hunting itself, even though hunting is what outside observers most often described. The Comancheros were part of that traffic, and their role is one of the more carefully documented and least widely known chapters of the story. Formal trade between the Spanish of New Mexico and the Comanche was established after 1786, when Governor Juan Bautista de Anza, having led a campaign that killed the Comanche leader Cuerno Verde the year before, negotiated a treaty that traded peace for regulated commerce. New Mexican governors licensed traders to travel into Comanche territory, and over the following decades an entire caravan economy grew up around that license. Mule trains and ox carts loaded with knives, beads, tobacco, cloth, coffee, flour, and metal goods, all bound for rendezvous points scattered across the Llano Estacado and the canyon country below the Caprock. Places like Quitac and Yellow House Canyon, and a site in what is now Harding County called Cejita de los Comancheros, became recurring meeting grounds, marked on no official map but known intimately to the traders who returned to them year after year. In exchange for their manufactured goods, the Comancheros took home buffalo robes, dried meat, tallow, horses, and, as the herds of Texas cattlemen expanded after the Civil War, increasingly large numbers of stolen cattle, driven west into New Mexico and sold to buyers who did not ask where the brands had come from. This trade did something that the American military establishment did not fully grasp until it was already fighting a losing war because of it. It gave the Comanche and the Kiowa access to firearms and ammunition long after the United States government believed it had cut off their supply lines. When Texas and federal authorities pushed the tribes onto reservation land near Fort Sill in the years following the Civil War, a significant portion of each band simply refused to stay there, and the Comanchero trade meant they did not need to. They could winter on the Llano Estacado, hunt buffalo, raid Texas settlements and Mexican ranches for horses and cattle, and trade the proceeds to Comancheros, who would sell them arms in return. General William Tecumseh Sherman, touring Texas in 1871, after narrowly missing an ambush at Salt Creek that killed a wagon train crew, came away convinced that the war on the southern plains could not be won as long as the Llano Estacado remained, in practical military terms, unmapped and unreachable. The Comanche were not hiding in the plain, they were living in it, on their own terms, in a landscape that had defeated every earlier attempt to bring an army through it. The scale of that defeat is easy to understate today. Captain Randolph B. Marcy, one of the more capable topographical officers the Army ever produced, had explored the edges of the Llano Estacado as early as 1852 while searching for the headwaters of the Red River, and his reports described a tableland so uniform so lacking in landmarks, water, or timber that a column could become lost within sight of its own starting point. Marcy's surveys gave the army its first real vocabulary for the terrain, but vocabulary was not the same as access. 20 years later, in 1871, when Colonel Ranald Mackenzie took command of the 4th United States Cavalry and began pushing expeditions into the Panhandle in earnest, his men were still moving through country that no American force had reliably crossed. That October, Mackenzie's column was ambushed in Blanco Canyon, and Mackenzie himself was wounded by an arrow, a small, sharp reminder that the Comanche knew this ground and the army did not. A year of frustrating, largely fruitless patrols followed. The Llano Estacado kept its secrets. What broke the impasse was not a larger army or a better weapon, it was information, the kind that only someone who had actually lived inside the trade network could provide. And that is where Eduardo Ortiz's capture becomes more than a footnote. In the spring of 1872, General Christopher Auger, commanding the Department of Texas, sent a reconnaissance patrol out from Fort Concho under Captain Napoleon Bonaparte McLaughlin, specifically to test what the captured Comanchero had told his interrogators. McLaughlin's 2-month patrol confirmed it. The main Comanche force really was wintering along the Red River, deep in the plain, in country the army had previously written off as impassable for a column of any size. Auger summoned Mackenzie to San Antonio. The two men laid out a strategy built directly on Ortiz's testimony, and by late July, Mackenzie was moving north out of Fort Richardson with 12 officers, 272 enlisted men, and a target on the map for the first time in the history of this war. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. On September 29, 1872, Mackenzie's column found and struck a large Comanche encampment near the North Fork of the Red River, not far from where the town of Le Fort sits today. The battle itself was brief by the standards of the wars that would follow it. What made it decisive was not the body count, but the horses. Mackenzie's troops captured somewhere near 1,000 animals from the Comanche herd, and rather than try to hold or drive that many horses back to a fort, in a decision that would become the army's standard tactic against the Southern Plains tribes for the rest of the decade, he had most of them shot. For a Comanche band, the horse herd was not property in the way a rancher understood property, it was mobility, wealth, hunting capacity, and military strength combined into a single living resource, and destroying it did more lasting damage than any number of casualties in the fight itself. The survivors of the North Fork camp regrouped, as bands on the plains always had, but something had changed. The army had proven it could find them, and now it had also proven it could return. The significance of the 1872 campaign is easy to miss if you only look at the battle itself, because by later standards, it was a modest engagement. Its real importance is what it taught the United States Army about the Llano Estacado, and that lesson compounded over the following 2 years into something the Comanche and Kiowa could not survive. Mackenzie had walked away from the North Fork fight with something no American officer had reliably possessed before, a working knowledge of Comanche watering holes, travel routes, seasonal movement patterns, and preferred refuges within the plain itself. When the government's so-called peace policy collapsed in 1874, after a summer of raids that included the attack on buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls, General Philip Sheridan ordered 5 separate army columns to converge on the Panhandle from different directions in what became known as the Red River War. Mackenzie's column, moving through terrain he now understood in a way his 1871 self had not, located the combined Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho encampments hidden deep inside Palo Duro Canyon, a 45-mile gash in the caprock that most of the plains residents assumed no cavalry force could ever reach. On September 28, 1874, Mackenzie's men led their horses single file down a narrow buffalo trail into that canyon before dawn, guided in part, once again, by information wrung from a captured Comanchero who had been intercepted on his way to trade with the very people Mackenzie was hunting. The army routed the camps below, and while the human casualties were relatively light, since most residents scattered up the canyon walls and escaped, the material loss was total. Lodges, winter food stores, buffalo robes, and tools accumulated over a lifetime were burned. And once again, the army turned to the horses. Roughly 1,400 animals were driven into nearby Tule Canyon and shot, a single, deliberate act that removed the Plains tribe's capacity to hunt, to flee, or to fight through the coming winter. Bands that had eluded every previous American campaign began surrendering to the reservation at Fort Sill within months, exhausted, on foot, and without the herds that had made their way of life possible. Quanah Parker, the Quijada Comanche leader whose mother had been taken captive as a child, held out longer than most, but by June of 1875, even his band came in. The war that had defined the Southern Plains since before the United States existed as a nation was effectively over, and the chain of events that ended it can be traced back, link by link, to a trader's testimony given under interrogation 3 years earlier on a plane the army had, until then, never truly entered. What the record leaves out is almost as telling as what it includes. Ortiz's testimony survives because army officers wrote it down, and because historians later found it in military correspondence, not because anyone at the time considered a Comanchero's knowledge worth preserving for its own sake. The Comancheros themselves, despite having operated for nearly a century as the primary economic bridge between two civilizations that otherwise fought each other, left almost no written record of their own. Most were illiterate or semi-literate traders working in a cash economy that generated bills of trade, not memoirs. What we know of their routes, their rendezvous points, and their role in supplying the last free bands of Comanche and Kiowa comes largely from the outside, from Spanish licensing records, from American Army reports, from the occasional captured trader's forced statement. The people who arguably knew the Llano Estacado better than anyone alive in the 1870s, better than the cavalry officers who eventually mastered it, and far better than the American public that would later mythologize the conquest of the plains, appear in the historical record mostly as a problem to be solved or a source to be squeezed for information. The Comanche side of the record is fuller, but it did not arrive intact either. Much of what modern historians know about Comanche strategic thinking during this period, their reasoning for staying off the reservation, their assessment of the Army's capabilities, their internal debates over whether to fight or surrender, comes from testimony given after the fact, during captivity, through interpreters, to officials who had their own reasons for shaping the narrative a particular way. Quanah Parker himself became, in the decades after his surrender, an important source for later historians and ethnographers, and his recollections, along with those of other Comanche elders interviewed in the early 20th century, form much of the foundation for what is now understood about pre-reservation Comanche life. But those accounts were gathered decades after the events they describe, filtered through translation, and shaped by a survivor's need to explain a defeat to the descendants of the people who had inflicted it. None of this makes the record false. It makes it partial, the way almost every historical record of a conquered people is partial, assembled more fully from the files of the conquerors than from the voices of the conquered. The physical trace of this history is still there for anyone who goes looking. The Llano Estacado remains one of the flattest, most starkly beautiful landscapes in North America, a tableland covering roughly 30,000 square miles across the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico, still largely defined by the Caprock Escarpment that made it so difficult for 19th-century armies to enter and exit. Palo Duro Canyon, the site of Mackenzie's decisive 1974 strike, is now a Texas state park, and visitors can walk the same rim the Kiowa and Comanche climbed to escape the cavalry below. Cart trails cut by Comanchero traders 2 centuries ago can still be traced in places, worn into the land by generations of wheels moving between New Mexico and the plain. County and museum collections in the Panhandle Preserve trade goods, cart parts, and documents connected to the Comanchero economy, a trade that operated in the open for 100 years and still occupies only a narrow footnote in the larger story most Americans learn about the settling of the West. The Comanche Nation itself did not vanish with the surrender at Fort Sill in 1875. It endured the reservation era, the allotment policies of the following decades, and the 20th century, and today the Comanche Nation is headquartered in Lawton, Oklahoma, with tribal enrollment numbering in the tens of thousands. Quanah descendants still live among them, and the tribe maintains its own historical and cultural programs documenting a past that for a long time was told almost entirely by the side that had won it. What the campaign of 1872 and 1874 actually demonstrates, when you set it against the 2 centuries that preceded it, is not the inevitability of American expansion, which is how the story is often compressed into a single sentence in survey histories. It demonstrates how narrow the margin was, how long the Comanche Empire actually held the interior of a continent that a much larger, much better supplied nation could not cross without the help of a captured trader who knew the ground because his family had walked it, and traded on it, for 100 years before an American cavalry officer ever set foot on the Llano Estacado. What tends to be passed over in the standard accounts is the question of what the Comanche themselves recorded about the places the army never found. Oral tradition among the Quijada and the Kotzoteca carried detailed geographic memory, the kind built across generations of seasonal movement that named specific formations, springs, and canyon systems in ways no federal survey ever captured. Ethnographers working on the southern plains in the early 20th century, among them Wallace and Hobel, whose joint fieldwork with Comanche consultants in the 1930s produced what became a foundational text on Comanche society, noted that elder informants described places within the Llano Estacado that had no corresponding entry in any official cartographic record. Some of these were springs that had gone dry by the time any Anglo surveyor reached them. Others were canyon shelters so well screened by caprock formations that search parties in 1873 and 1874 passed within a few miles without detecting them. The Army's own after-action reports from the Red River War acknowledged that Mackenzie's forces never reached several encampment sites that surrendering Comanche described during debriefing at Fort Sill, and that soldiers who fanned out across the Llano Estacado in pursuit found country that still defeated their navigation even after 2 years of campaigning. There is one account within that body of oral record that surfaces repeatedly in the ethnographic literature, but has never received sustained attention in the broader history of the Southern Plains. Multiple Comanche consultants interviewed by different researchers across a span of nearly 40 years described, in consistent enough terms to constitute a pattern, a place their grandfathers had known and declined to revisit. The descriptions vary in minor detail across the accounts but share a geographic core. A dry canyon system west of the main Palo Duro complex, deeper than the surveyed formations, accessible only through a passage that required horses to be led single file through fractured caprock, and containing within it a series of stone arrangements that the speakers attributed not to their own people, but to a people who had been on the plain before the Comanche arrived. The Comanche oral record was precise about their own arrival on the southern plains, placing it in the early 1700s, which aligns with what documentary and archaeological evidence supports. The stone arrangements in the canyon their grandfathers refused to enter were older, the consultant said, than anyone in living Comanche memory could account for. One account, recorded by an ethnographer working for the Bureau of American Ethnology in 1922 and preserved in unpublished field notes held at the Smithsonian Institution's National Anthropological Archives, described the site as a place where the ground had been cleared in patterns, where stones had been moved with a purpose no one remaining could read, and where the Comanche who first encountered it had left it alone out of a deference the consultant translated, through an interpreter, as something closer to recognition than fear. Recognition that whoever had worked that ground had done so with an intention the landscape still held, even after the people who carried it forward were gone. The field note sits in a folder, catalogued under a broader survey of Southern Plains material culture. It was cited once, briefly, in a 1961 dissertation examining Comanche cosmological belief, and has not appeared in print since. The canyon system it gestures toward, west of Palo Duro and south of the Canadian River breaks, has not been the subject of any formal archaeological survey. The caprock formations in that area are rugged enough that pedestrian survey would be difficult and costly, and the region has seen no development pressure sufficient to trigger the kind of compliance archaeology that has documented other Southern Plains sites. The stone arrangements, if they exist, remain where the Comanche oral record placed them, in country the Army never fully mapped, below a rim the survey teams never formally crossed. What the land holds beneath its named and catalogued surface is rarely what the official record suggests. The Llano Estacado was mapped, after a fashion, in the years following the Red River War, as ranching operations moved onto the plain and fence lines began dividing country that had sustained a mobile empire for 150 years. Those surveys captured what ranchers needed: water sources, grass, elevation changes relevant to cattle movement. They were not looking for stone arrangements in dry canyon systems, and nothing in the institutional mandate of the General Land Office or the later Geological Survey directed anyone to look. The physical evidence that the Comanche oral record describes sits outside the frame of every survey conducted in that country, not because anyone chose to exclude it, but because the frame was drawn around other questions entirely, and the questions the Comanche consultants were answering in those ethnographic interviews were questions no survey team had thought to ask. The Comanche Nation continues to hold that oral record within its own cultural preservation work. The tribe's Historic Preservation Office, established under the terms of the National Historic Preservation Act, has documented a number of traditional cultural properties across the former extent of Comancheria, and tribal historians have worked with state and federal agencies on specific sites within the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico. Whether the canyon system described in the 1922 field note has been brought into that preservation framework is not a matter of public record. What is a matter of public record is that the Bureau of American Ethnology field notes in question are accessible to researchers, that the geographic descriptions within them are specific enough to inform a targeted survey, and that no published archaeological study has yet addressed what the formation those notes describe might show. The absence is not a secret, it is simply an absence, the kind that accumulates when the institutions charged with assembling a record build that record around their own priorities, rather than around the full range of what the land and the people who lived on it actually knew. The chain of decisions that kept the canyon out of any formal record was not a single act of suppression. It was a long series of institutional choices, each made for reasons that had nothing to do with the canyon at all. The Army's surveyors after 1874 were counting grass and water for the cattle industry moving north behind the retreating Comanche. The Bureau of American Ethnology's field teams in the early 20th century were working under mandates that prioritized linguistic and cultural documentation over geographic inquiry. The dissertation writer in 1961 was building an argument about Comanche belief systems and had no reason to pursue a geographic lead buried in a field note. No single person chose not to look. The looking simply never became anyone's specific responsibility, and in that gap the oral record and the physical evidence it describes have remained where they were placed, outside the frame of every account that followed. The Comanche who advised their grandfathers to leave that canyon undisturbed were not being imprecise. They recognized something in a landscape that had already been shaped by human intention, and they chose to leave it as they found it. That choice preserved something the Army never reached, the survey teams never mapped, and the standard history of the Southern Plains has never needed to account for. The plain still holds it, the caprock still screens it. The field note that points toward it sits in an archive in Washington, filed and catalogued and available, waiting for someone to read it the way it deserves to be read, not as a footnote in a survey of cosmological belief, but as a geographic record left by people who knew exactly where they were and exactly what they were looking at. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.